let me first start the recording. Okay, there we go. So welcome.
Okay, awesome. So let me just try to share my screen.
Just to be brutal on you speakers now, I'm going to just write on your screen. When you have 5 minutes left, I'm going to write a big 5 minutes on top of your slide. Okay, so get to the point. Basically, that's the point. Get to the point.
I think that we are
I think giving half an hour is a long time. I think we should keep it to 20 minutes and then 5 minutes from there.
So for discussions.
Can I ask one question? Why do you introduce this new method really for the second talk, and whereas the first talk went for 50 minutes, right? I find it somewhat unfair to impose now all the time constraints on the second talk.
Just for you, Wolfgang, it would be just 5 minutes because you're good.
We're going to have this additional discussion afterwards, so then we can make it a much lengthier one, right? So don't worry. But just for the presentation part, just to have a shorter one at the moment. Go for it, Anand.
Okay, so you can see my slides, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. So me and Wolfgang Maass are going to be talking about new learning methods for recurrent networks of spiking neurons. So I'm Anand. I'm a PhD student at Graz University of Technology in Wolfgang Maass's group. Okay, so the work that we're going to present was done with a number of other people, it covers mainly content from these two papers listed below. So we'll give you references to the paper whenever we are talking about something that is contained in there. Okay, so the question that we asked was, can deep learning be implemented in neuromorphic chips? And so commonly, if you're familiar with deep learning, you know that it uses convolutional neural networks, usually, or other feed-forward networks. Where in the context of, if you're doing temporal processing, then it usually uses backpropagation through time applied to LSTM or LSTM-like networks. And in the context of deep reinforcement learning, it tends to use pixel-level episode replay or many agents that learn in parallel. And generally, all of these are difficult to implement efficiently on spike-based neuromorphic hardware. So we wish to address this problem using the following strategy. So our strategy is to use chip-friendly online learning methods for recurrent networks of spiking neurons. We use approximations of gradient descent for arbitrary loss functions. And we use single agent learning with additional methods to mitigate performance degradation. Right? So this is what we're going to be talking about in today's talk, how exactly we do this. So I'll start off with the first two aspects, which is online learning methods that approximate gradient descent for arbitrary loss functions. And so this method, we call it EPROB. So it's a learning approach for recurrent networks of spiking neurons. And it implements learning like is usually done in deep learning, which is by minimization of a loss function E with respect to some synaptic weights. So the effective weight update that comes out from EPROB looks something like this. So the weight update is a product of two particular terms. So one is what we call the eligibility trace, which is where the E in the EPROB comes from. And this eligibility trace is something that is that brings information from the past. So in the schematic figure, you can see these blue arrows, which are the eligibility trace. And so it just brings information from the past and depends only on the neuronal dynamics of the neurons connected to each synapse. So there is one eligibility trace for each synapse, and it depends only on the neuronal dynamics. It doesn't depend on the loss function. And then the second important part of this weight update is what we call the learning signal. And this learning signal is specific for postsynaptic neuron. And actually, like a lot of the talk is going to be about how to choose these learning signals so that we can do something interesting. So actually, in the simplest case, this particular learning rule can also represent backpropagation through time. If the learning signal is chosen to be the total derivative of the loss function with respect to the spikes of the neuron. So this total derivative takes into consideration the effect of the spikes of the neuron on the future loss, and also the effect of the spike of that neuron on the loss indirectly through other neurons, because it's a recurrent network. And so obviously this is not online or local, but in this ideal case, it does, it is equivalent to backpropagation through time. Right? So this weight update really comes as a normative model starting from backpropagation through time, and then we figure out how to make it local and online. So one of the ways to make it local and online is basically ignore all the non-local effects. So we ignore the temporal non-locality and the spatial non-locality, which is mathematically, you can write that as defining the learning signal as a partial derivative of the loss function with respect to the spike of that neuron, J at time t. And so this is one way to generate the learning signals, which is online and local, and we call this random EPROP. So you'll see this term in the rest of this. And in this paper that is listed below, you can see the derivation of how exactly this corresponds to backpropagation through time, and what happens, more details about what happens when you do this approximation, when you ignore these non-local effects. So this also, each component of this update also corresponds to known biological signals. So we did take a lot of inspiration from biology when we kind of wrote down this particular form of this weight update. And as I mentioned already, the normative model is derived from backpropagation through time, but it also provides a lot of insights into how learning can happen in biology. Right? And obviously, since it's online and local, it can be implemented on neuromorphic hardware. So that's like our main motivation over here. So what we have now is a way of implementing some approximation of backpropagation through time in a local and online manner, which means that we can implement backpropagation or deep learning in neuromorphic hardware. Okay, so and so so that's the general kind of abstract concept of EPROP. And now I'm going to discuss one specific use case, which is deep reinforcement learning. So again, with deep reinforcement learning, one of the key pillars of deep reinforcement learning has been using gradient descent and backpropagation on deep networks. And so we want to leverage this full power of this gradient descent for recurrent spiking neural networks using an approximation, but specifically in the context of reinforcement learning. So we focus on this class of algorithms called policy gradient algorithms. So these are actually one of the most powerful reinforcement learning algorithms that are used currently. So the initial work was that we base our work on was published in 2016, but even recently, if you happen to read this DeepMind's StarCraft paper, they use a variation of policy gradient to play StarCraft better than or almost as good as humans. Right? And so with policy gradient, the general idea is that you learn the policy directly, and you learn the policy by trying variations of actions proposed by some network that you're training, and update the weights of this network using an estimator for the loss gradient to update the weights. So more concretely, this is what the setup looks like. So we have a network over here, which is recurrent and spiking. So we actually include, so these are like most of the spiking neurons are leaky integrate and fire neurons, but we also have like a modification of this lift neurons with spike frequency adaptation that provide long short-term memory to this recurrent network. So we have this recurrent network that produces two different outputs. So one is the outputs that lead to the action generation, which then interact with the environment. And on the other side, the network also predicts the value of each state in the environment. And the overall goal of policy gradient is to maximize the expected returns, right? So you want to get as much reward as possible. Although you don't directly maximize expected rewards, but you maximize expected return, where return is the discounted sum of future rewards. So you don't just care about the reward you get in the next time step, but you want to get the overall best reward for the entire length of the episode, right? So if you have a goal position that where you get a reward, then you're not going to get a reward until you reach the goal position. So you want to maximize this future possibility of reward and not just the current one. And in general, this kind of setup also uses this value prediction B. So the network is always also predicting what the value of the state is. So what is the discounted sum of future rewards that can be achieved from this state if you follow the current policy. And so this, to maximize this loss function, this can be reduced to this particular estimator of this gradient of this loss function. So you have a policy loss and a value loss. And the estimator requires us to take the gradient of one term, which is the pi is the policy. So pi is the mapping, which given some input, it tells you what action you should take. So you have one term that depends on the policy, and then you have another term that depends on the value function, value prediction. And so this is a very general form of policy gradient. So this is like nothing new so far. So this is also not online and local, but what you want to do is you want to take this, make it online and local, and be able to update the synaptic weights using this. So there are a couple of reasons why this is not online and local. So one of them is there is this term return in this estimator, and the return requires future rewards. So at the current time step, you need to know the future to be able to calculate this return. And this is like clearly not possible unless you wait for the end of the episode or something. And the second part is just this total derivative contains terms from a lot of other weights. So it doesn't depend just on one synapse, but like the entire network, because everything is interconnected. So to solve both of these, so both of these can be addressed. So for the return, the one way of making it completely online, which means we want to just use information that we have available at the current time step or from the past, but not information from the future. So we use the equivalence of the forward and backward view with temporal difference error. So this is basically using the value prediction, and you calculate the temporal difference error as the difference between the actual reward you got and the bootstrap value prediction for the next time step, minus the value prediction of the current time step. So the value prediction is coming from your recurrent network. So you only need, so you don't need to know the entire future, but you bootstrap it using the prediction of the network for the next time step, right? So this kind of solves the problem of calculating the return. And the second part is to use eProb, right? Which allows us to calculate the gradients using only local information, or approximately using local information. And so applying both of these to the gradient estimator that we saw in the previous slide, what you end up with is a weight update that looks something like this. So this F is a low pass filter with the appropriate time constant. So F gamma is a low pass filter with the time constant of gamma, with the decay of gamma, and this Fk is with the decay of kappa. And so you have a term with which is the eligibility traces, which come from only the past and depend only on the neuronal dynamics. You have a learning signal, so I'll get into that in a minute. And you have the temporal difference error, which can be calculated at every time step. Its eligibility trace can be calculated online at every time step, and so can the temporal difference error. And we also use a form of the learning signal where we use an instantaneous estimate of the policy and value terms in the gradient estimator. But instead of using the actual weights that are used to generate this, we use random feedback weights. So this is actually like an idea borrowed from broadcast alignment in machine learning literature, where you don't assume that the same weights that go forward also transmit the error information backwards, but we use a separate set of random feedback weights to do this. And so overall, this is what the weight update looks like. And all of these terms can be calculated at every time step. So all of these terms can be calculated locally. And the learning signal, we do like ignore non-local terms over there. So you don't need information about the other weights in the recurrent network.
So Anand, so I just step in with a very short question. One of the participants wants to know why you have to have two different types of neurons for your model.
Right. So like networks of leaky integrated fire neurons don't tend to have very long short-term memory. And so in machine learning, people use these networks called LSTMs. And it is specifically to be able to train the network to remember things for a longer time. And so our LIF neurons with spike frequency adaptation is a biologically plausible and model of this, which is just a slight adaptation of the LIF model with adaptive thresholds.
So could you make it all A-LIFs?
Yes, you could.
Okay.
And this, Andreas, a quick question follow up to that. What is the time scale differences between the LIFs and the A-LIFs?
So it is a few orders of magnitude. So
few orders of magnitude. Okay.
Few orders.
Yeah. So for example, like ALIF, I mean, it depends on the task. So ALIF has this adaptive threshold where you can choose the time constant depending upon the task. And many of the tasks we do is like on order of a second or so. And LIF, the only time constant it has is the membrane potential, which is usually the order of like tens of milliseconds or a few milliseconds or so.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so what we did was we took this, so this application of EPROP to reinforcement learning, we call it reward-based EPROP. And we took reward-based EPROP and applied, tried to train a network to play Pong from Atari. Right? And so Pong, I mean, so at the Atari games, I mean, if you're familiar with deep learning literature, there was a paper in 2015 where it was a big deal that the Atari games could be played. So the network was able to play Atari games better than humans. So it was able to achieve human level performance. And then there was a policy gradient method, which was published the following year, which improved on these human level results. And we are now basing our algorithm on this policy gradient method that was published. And and we do successfully train this network to play Pong, and it actually does quite well. And this is entirely achieved with spiking neurons, as you can see in this video over here. So we have the LIF and ALIF neurons, which are spiking, and then we have the output of this network. So this pi is the output that the network is giving, which tells you what should be the probability of taking a certain action. And there are three possible actions. One is to move the paddle up, one to move it down, and one to stay where it was. Right? Don't move it, basically. And the network is controlling this green paddle over here on the right side. And you see here, and the network, you see here that the network is producing all of these outputs at every time step. So we're not really waiting for like an entire episode to finish or anything, right? So it's able to calculate, it's producing all of these outputs at every instantaneously, and it is also able to calculate all the terms that are required to update the weights online. So over here, you see the temporal difference error, the filtered version of this learning signal times filtered eligibility trace. So this was one of the terms, and then also the weight, weights itself. So this is just like one example weight, but the network is able to update its weights using reward-based EPROP online.
Who is playing red? Because red is not doing very well.
So red is the computer-controlled agent that is provided by the Atari simulation, basically.
Okay. Is it?
Right. Yeah. Did you have a question or?
Oh no, I was wondering. I thought Wolfgang was taking over from when you
Okay.
paused there.
Yeah, I have like one last slide.
Okay. All right.
which is just to show like a more quantitative results of this agent's performance. And we compared this agent's performance. So this is the learning curve where we plot the episodic return, the episode return, and the number of frames that have been used for training so far. And we compare it with two different baselines. So one is this policy gradient paper that I mentioned earlier, They call their algorithm A3C, asynchronous advantage actor critic. And we compare it with the feed-forward version of that algorithm and a version with an LSTM, which is a recurrent network. And so what we're able to see is that reward-based EPROP is able to achieve the same level of performance as the recurrent, as the A3C with LSTM. And so of course, the only difference is that this reward-based EPROP does learn a bit slower. So it doesn't learn as fast as just using artificial neural networks with backpropagation through time, but it is able to reach the same level of performance. Right? And this was at that time really like the state-of-the-art performance for Atari games.
But your model is sort of an actor-critic model also, right? I mean, you could think
yes,
of
it is an actor. Yeah. Exactly, yeah. Yeah. So it is an actor-critic model, so which is kind of like a subset of policy gradient.
Okay.
Methods.
Right. Thank you.
All right, thanks. So next part will be presented by Wolfgang. So I'll stop screen sharing now.
Okay. So can you see my slide? No?
Yes, but probably can you put in presentation mode?
Yeah, so this is the next thing. Okay.
Lovely. Yes.
So hello, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for inviting us. So I want to discuss here a newer aspect of EPROP, namely another idea how to generate learning signals actually in a way which is, in a sense, more biologically realistic, but also more powerful than. So as you had seen, the main weight change learning rule is this product of a learning signal with a local eligibility trace. And Anand discussed one version for the learning signal, random EPROP, which is inspired by broadcast alignment. And in our recent Nature Communications paper, we discussed two other options. But I want to present here now a completely new option. And it's biologically inspired because, for example, one brain area that is known to emit learning signal is the area VTA, which sends dopamine to wide parts of particularly the prefrontal cortex. And it's, I think, pretty safe to assume that this area VTA and the signals that it emits have been optimized by evolution to facilitate fast learning of survival relevant capabilities. There's actually also a new development on the side of neuroscience with regard to the signals which are emitted by VTA. So there was beautiful earlier theoretical work which suggested it would be great if reward prediction errors would be encoded by dopamine signals. And so therefore there were many papers which showed that VTA emits reward prediction errors. But in this recent paper from the Witten lab in Princeton there, which appeared in Nature last year, they had shown that actually it's much more complicated. VTA sends different learning signals or different dopaminergic signals to different populations of neurons in the brain, and they contain information about various other quantities besides reward prediction errors. So this is something which is maybe more difficult to integrate in kind of one of these more traditional reinforcement learning theories, but happens to be just the way how we want it for EPROP. And so in EPROP, we now assume there is a separate recurrent network of spiking neurons. We call it LSG, the learning signal generator. And we want to now mimic the evolutionary optimization of this learning signal generator for a large range of learning tasks. Think of the ones which are really relevant for the organism in a usual kind of environment then. And in order to kind of mimic this evolutionary optimization of this generator, we resort to this framework of learning to learn. I hope you are familiar with this. It has been around for quite some while. More recently, it has been discussed more in machine learning. So there are two levels of learning. So basically, you have here in the inner loop shown in blue, you have here just this network which learns something, a given task. But then there is an outer loop and another learner where in a separate learning algorithms, some parameters theta can be adjusted then. And here in this architecture all the black arcs have weights which are adjusted in this outer loop. So we assume, they're set by evolution, they're right, they're not changed within a current learning task then. Now, a key aspect of this learning to learn framework is that you're not focusing on optimizing parameters for a single task, but for a large family of tasks. Think of an infinitely large family of tasks, which we actually consider here. We consider here we'll present two examples for such family F of tasks then. And then the dynamics is you pick a random task from this family C, you train in the inner loop this neural network. In our case, you train it by EPROP, using the learning signals which are provided by the separate spike neural network. Then you look at the result then, and you use these results to update this in the outer loop learning, these parameters like these black arcs here. But this happened all before we now look at the current learning tasks then, right? So because they are fixed then. But there are these two levels of learning. I hope this is reasonably clear to everybody. So it was a very quick introduction of this. So let me just then go to these two demos. And both are demos of one-shot learning, which is something which we're a little bit surprised that it really comes out so easily. As you know, for a long time one had criticized deep learning and many other learning methods from machine learning by really requiring many more training examples than human, right? Whereas humans can learn important things from single example or a few examples at least, whereas typical learning methods need zillions of examples. This is obviously also particularly important for applications of learning to real robots, right? Because the robot typically doesn't last to go through 10,000 training trials there. And so therefore, this is actually tasks which you consider in this context. So we assume that somebody gives you a desired arm movement, more specific the trajectory of the end effector then. And then the recurrent network of spiky neurons should learn this to produce this arm movement. So it controls the torques for two joints then. And so this here in this case, this main recurrent network of spiky neurons that learns through natural EPROP outputs these torques then. It has this learning signal generator, which was optimized by going through lots of arm movements. But here we challenge this this network with a new arm movement, which has never seen then. And so this is actually fairly small network of spike neurons, recurrent neurons, about 400 in this case then. And here this is just a single demo. So here is this given arm movement in XY coordinates is given here in blue then. And this neural network has no idea what to do. It just produces these movements then. And this is here the activity of this main network. This is of the LSG then. But then in the second trial, so we actually, let me also say one thing. So here we let natural EPROP run through the single trial then, lasting 500 milliseconds. But we actually do all the weight updates here at the end of this 500 milliseconds. And now it can try again then. And you see on the right that this given arm movement is almost without error reproduced now by this model. So it really has learned this particular new arm movement, which it has never seen before in a single trial. There's also, I think, one interesting story, which I like quite a bit on a more general level. If you look what are the learning signals which are actually emitted here by this optimized LSG, optimized for learning arm movements. Here is a kind of a plot. Here you see kind of the sum of all the signals then. So now here this phase, the kind of their peak then. If you compare this with these ideal learning signals of backpropagation through time, which is simply the derivative of the total loss with regard to the spikes, you see that it has a quite different structure than. And this is goes against the idea that we are just trying to approximate backpropagation through time, that really backpropagation through time is the gold standard and we can never kind of get close or even above it. Here, I think one sees now that BPTT is good because it's extremely general, right? You can learn everything with this. But if you know already that you're just about to learn arm movements, you can do much better then. And this is what we exploit in this particular setup there. But I think this is an idea which can be applied now to many other settings. Quickly, as a last demo, I just want to show here also that one of these more standard benchmark tasks for one-shot learning for machine learning can be tackled now with natural EPROP. And so this is Omniglot. So I'm not sure whether you have seen Omniglot. Now, Omniglot is like MNIST. Now you have many classes of characters. In MNIST, now you have just 10 digits. Here you have over 1,600 different classes, which are really pulled together from many different alphabets, many Asian alphabets. No, I've never seen them. So some of them you will see some examples are really complicated characters. And this has the advantage that you can do better training and testing then because you simply have more classes of characters. So here there are samples of single samples from 4 different classes, but you can also, you still have then within a single class of characters, you have quite a variance. You're all familiar with this effect from MNIST then. But we have now the advantage, since we have so many character classes, we can reserve in this learn-to-learn approach, some of them just for testing this, so they were never used for training. And so this is now a single sample from a new class of characters, which was never exposed to this spiking neural networks. And subsequent, the task for you is the following. You will see afterwards 5 more samples where one of them is from the same class as this character and 4 are from other classes, which are also new classes. And you simply should output a 1, raise your hand for the sample in the sequence that belongs to the same class as this character, and otherwise output 0. So this is not the sample. You have no long time to look at it. Now this is the first sequence, yes or no, yes or no, yes or no, yes or no, yes or no. So here this is the structure of the task. This was the sample, and then this was the sequence of 5 different characters from 5 different classes, but this was from the same class as this one, although on a pixel level it's not the same symbol, right? So therefore, in order to solve this task successfully, you can't just learn by heart which pixels are on. Really, you have to know what are the abstract properties which characterize this written this alphabet symbols then. And it turns out when we train a recurrent network of spiking neurons with natural EPROP, it achieves 83% then, which doesn't look so great, but it's actually very close to what we were able to do then. So maybe you can test it. We give all the code here in the paper, whether you are somewhat better than. But since it's an online estimate, you have to decide at each moment, is this now similar enough or not then? So it's a non-trivial task. But in particular, I'm happy that kind of all this large range of one-shot learning results, which you can see in machine learning, can now be approached by spiking neural networks, in particular also by neuromorphic hardware, right? There's nothing in here which you could not do by neuromorphic hardware. And typically, I think it also suggests a kind of 2 phases of learning for neuromorphic hardware. In the factory, maybe you can download weights which correspond to the learning in the outer loop, but then on the device, then you want to have very quick learning right now on the device. And so this would be here this one-shot learning, for example, as it has been demonstrated here then. So altogether now, as Anand has shown, now EPROP provides a quite powerful online approximation to backpropagation through time for training recurrent networks of spiking neurons. So we considered mainly spiking neurons so far. One can also apply it to artificial neural networks then, but we don't have a motivation for this at the moment. As far as we know, EPROP is compatible with constraints of neuromorphic hardware and is actually currently implemented on Spinnaker and on the next version of Intel's Louis. The only reason why it cannot be currently implemented on Louis, it currently doesn't support this pseudo-derivatives, kind of a factor coming from depending on the postsynaptic membrane potential, which is not supported by Louis. Then we see that in principle, I think, with these methods, we can really enable neuromorphic hardware also to approach the performance level of machine learning, which is often close to the human performance level. So Anand has demonstrated this in the case of deep reinforcement learning. I have demonstrated this in the case of one-shot learning, something also we humans can do. And also, I think it's quite interesting to conceptually to analyze this natural EPROP, because I think it gives us a new perspective of really also analyzing and hopefully understanding what are the signals which are emitted by area VTA in the brain and other areas which emit learning signals. Thanks you for your attention.
Thanks, Wolfgang. It was very nice and short to the point. So actually, I'm curious, Wolfgang, I have one question is, could you have done this also with analog neurons?
Yeah, I don't see any reason then that one cannot use it, the analog neurons then, yeah.
Okay, all right. Toby had one question. Toby, did you want to ask yourself?
Thanks, Wolfgang. Yeah, that was to the point. Okay, both of you, really to the point. But the question I had was rather ignorant question. It was just kind of a trivial question about your motor learning example, because I know Michael Pfeiffer, and when Michael Pfeiffer was showing these lovely results where his expectation maximization thing was very good at picking out patterns that I'd seen just once. Remember that stuff? But then in the end, that didn't have so much impact. There was some weakness with it, which somehow wasn't ever really exploited for anything. So I'm just wondering if you're not telling us something that is a problem that you're not confessing. Right? What's the real problem here? Like in the case of Michael Pfeiffer's expectation maximization and discovering, quickly learning temporal patterns and discovering them again, what's the real weakness here that perhaps people should really try to work on?
I'm not quite sure.
Is it the cat's meow, right? Is it really going to replace like supervised learning and BPTT for supervised methods? Are you just recommending this?
Yeah, I think I'm not quite capturing, because at the same time, actually, I was reading in your chat question, which was a completely different one, right?
Yeah, this is a different one. That was just about motor learning. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with this result of Michael Pfeiffer then. So we have to see.
It was from your group. It was while he was with you guys, right?
And perhaps the answer is catastrophic forgetting, right?
No, it was this work that he did, with this unsupervised learning of the MNIST digits, I believe.
I know, but I believe, it's Andreas, I believe that work, it wasn't really an online algorithm. The beauty of what Wolfgang is talking now, I mean, this is an online algorithm. EM algorithm.
No, it was online. Anyway, let's not discuss that then if it's not current.
So
if I may say something. Okay. But one thing I think which seems to be important to this point of Toby is, there are of course unsupervised learning, but typically actually unsupervised learning takes a lot of time, right? So in our context, actually would make a lot of sense if we somehow get this LSG, this learning signal generator to learn on its own, right? Without supervisor then, but because this is really the lengthy part of all of this.
Okay, so let's have a longer discussion afterwards, because I think there are a lot of interesting questions. Yeah.
So can I just say something very quickly?
Sure.
So with EPROP, I mean, also it really comes from backpropagation through time, right? So it would have many of the same problems that backpropagation through time has, and then probably has some limitations because of the approximation, which is, I think, fairly obvious, but it is not, I don't think it would introduce fundamentally new problems that was not already known, or fundamentally new limitations.
I mean, you're saying it would also have vanishing gradient problem and stuff like that, right? It would also have the same difficulty getting convergence that come with
right. I mean,
BPTT.
So the thing is, it wouldn't have vanishing gradients problem because we are not propagating the gradients backwards all the way through time. No. Right, so we are using this online variant. So that is one thing it would not have. But then, of course, we are also ignoring the future, and we're ignoring non-local terms. Right, so that's why it takes longer to train also in many of these tasks. So, but catastrophic forgetting, for example, I mean, this is not something that would specifically address it. or make things worse or better compared to backpropagation through time by itself. But in principle, you could train like a learning signal generator that mitigates catastrophic forgetting if you wanted to using meta-learning, for example.
Okay. Okay, all right. So I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you.
And thank you, Anand and Wolfgang, for your presentations. Okay, so stop that.